Hello everybody, it's Wyvern here with another bit of Total War, Warhammer 2, Quick Match gameplay. This time around I'm playing as the Dwarves against the Dark Elves on a bit of, what should be a pretty promising bit of a fun match. We are running a flame cannon here, because this unit has been changed, and after seeing it in my Beastmen gameplay, and how well it actually performed against Bestigors, I really wanted to give it a shot and try it out against a faction that it's somewhat squishier, and still can't really trade range-wise with the Dwarves, so I wanted to give it a shot, so I did bring it here. So for my Lord, I did decide to bring the Rune Lord, and the Rune Lord is definitely not the best of combat lords. His combat stats are honestly pretty garbage, but he does have a lot of resistances, and it makes him very, very hard to kill. He does, of course, have 120 armor, a baseline, stacked on top of 52 melee defense, which is respectable. It's on the higher end for lords. He does have 25% physical resist, 35% missile resist, which of course is coming in with the help of one of his abilities. That is, it's an AOE missile resist missile resist effect. I also do have a significant damage magic resistance because I'm on the Anvil of Doom, and I can actually get an additional upgrade, the Locus of Power, which brings me up to 55% magic resistance. So magic damage basically doesn't work on this guy. He also does have immunity to psychology, and he provides it to all the units around him, which is very nice. Though obviously with a very frontline, pretty Longbeard centered, it's not too important. I did also, as you can see here, I did bring the Master Rune of Grungni. I also brought the Rune of Hearth and Home, which, as you can see, is providing them resistance to psychology. And then I only brought 2 runes. I brought Master Rune of Negation and Master Rune of Wrath and Ruin. The reason I didn't bring a Master Rune of Steel is because, quite frankly, against Dark Elves, they're going to bring a lot of armor piercing, and as Dwarves, it's not really going to help you. Yes, there are a handful of Dark Elf units that don't have armor piercing, but they're too rare in my opinion to justify bringing it. Alongside him, I did bring a Runesmith. Once again, Runesmith is coming in with the Rune of Negation as well as the Rune of Wrath and Ruin. I also threw in the Hammer of Karak Draz, which is a 47-second debuff to any unit. Minus 44 melee attack and minus 25% weapon damage is huge, especially against Hargoneth Executioners, which are one of the most common units, I think, against Dwarves, because they're very, very powerful against Dwarves. Otherwise, of course, he's not a total pushover in close quarters. He can definitely help stiffen up the front line with his 120 armor and okay melee stats. My other hero is the Thane over here on the other flank, and the Thane is, of course, coming in with a Tormentor Sword as well as the Master Rune of Stromny Redbeard, which provides a +5 melee attack boost to all the units around him, which I think is pretty nifty for Longbeards and even Ironbreakers and Thunderers and those sorts of units, because it does make him a little more competitive in close quarters, whereas Dwarves usually have fairly miserable melee stats. And of course, the Tormentor Sword will help debuff enemies if my opponent doesn't bring too much cav. Behind that, for my front line, I did bring 3 units of Longbeards. It is a very small front line, but then again, I don't have that much shooting either, and I've definitely invested quite a bit in Slayers, so my front line can't be too big. I've got 3 units of Longbeards, backed up by a single unit of Norcrimling's Ironbreakers. These guys, of course, are the Regiment of Renown. They can technically Vanguard deploy. I didn't bother with that, but they do have it's a 90 model unit of Ironbreakers. And they have ludicrous melee defense, decent enough melee attack, and they can just trade it out with just about anybody. And more importantly, though, those satchel charges will definitely help soften up enemy formations, especially from Hargoneth Executioners, which are one of the units I'm very worried about. Hargoneth Executioners and Dark Shards with shields. And these guys will perform rather well against them just because of those satchel charges. They work really, really well against the Hargoneth Executioners and their tight formations. Alongside that, I do have a single unit of Miners with Blasting Charges covering the flank. And in my backline, I do have a single unit of Slayers as well as the Dragonback Slayers covering my backline. And also there as a sort of pseudo-cav to potentially, if my opponent doesn't bring too much cavalry, or if I manage to shut them down quickly, these guys can actually flank around and go after the Dark Shards, whom I'm definitely worried my opponent will bring a lot of. Dark Shards with shield especially are incredibly powerful against Dwarves. For my shooting contingent, I have 2 units of Thunderers. Thunderers, of course, with their armor piercing. Once again, a counter to Hargoneth Executioners, also a counter to Dragons, and any flyers that my opponent might decide to bring. And finally, I did want to give it a shot to the legendary Flame Cannon, one of the most maligned units back in the day, but I do believe it does have a bit of a place now. It provides the leadership debuff, only burnt, not like the Skaven debuff, which I do believe is minus 16 leadership. It's only minus 8. But it still does a lot of damage. Surprisingly, armor-piercing missile damage is actually 75, and the armor-piercing splash damage is 20, so it actually does okay even against heavily armored units, and it does very, very well against slightly armored units, and debuffs them, makes them rout rather easily. So I'm hoping that as long as I can protect it against cavalry, I should be okay. For my opponent, he did decide to bring a somewhat interesting build. He did decide to bring Morathi, who's somewhere over here on foot. Morathi is actually definitely not a pushover lord. I think she's kind of underestimated a bit. She does, of course, have that physical resistance from being near the Cauldron of Blood. She has a 25% missile resist, though, of course, her unfortunately, I scrolled over a different unit there. She does have 15% missile resist, some magic resistance, and she does have some pretty cool spells. She does have Pit of Shades. It's a mix of power of Shadow, Death, and Lore of Dark. So definitely a pretty wide variety. She's also no pushover in melee, as I mentioned before. She does have the Enchanting Beauty, which is a constant AoE debuff to melee attack and charge bonus. And then when she's in melee, she has Heartrender Dark Sword, which is a further -9 melee defense and melee attack, which is actually a pretty crazy debuff. It's definitely much better than the special abilities, in my opinion, that Malekith gets. But she's, of course, much squishier than Malekith is. However, with Soul Stealer, she could definitely potentially heal up, in spite of the fact that I do have a 40% magic resistance in all of my units in my army, thanks to my Rune Lord. Alongside her, my opponent did bring a K-Knight Assassin. The K-Knight Assassin with, interestingly enough, a Black Dragon Egg by the look of it. This is not something you see all that often, but it is a pretty cool breath spell, and it's fairly cheap, I do believe. Black Lotus, of course, Discouraged Effect. He can cast on himself. He does, of course, have Web of Shadows, which is a pretty cool AoE damage spell. Assassin's Trophy, which is basically like a Trophy Rack, or I do believe it's called Trophy Rack, or which for debuffing enemy lords and heroes. And the K-Knight Assassin is, of course, both a good close quarters as well as ranged hero. He can definitely dish out a lot of hurt, in spite of the fact that he's not technically armor piercing. He will still do okay against the Dwarven infantry. So then my opponent does have a Death Hag, of course. Death Hag can make some units rampage, make him do a lot of damage. Interestingly enough, my opponent did decide to bring the Potion of Full Audience for that Unbreakable. She does, of course, have Witch Brew, so she can self-cast that, make herself rampage. She can also make other units rampage and boost their stats by a ludicrous amount. With Fury of Cain, which could definitely be a bit of a problem for me. Otherwise, she does have Chillblade, which is an even bigger melee attack debuff, so I'm definitely going to be very dependent on my shooting. And she does, of course, have Frenzy. She's a very powerful combatant. Her terror is going to be practically irrelevant in this situation because most of my units are immune to Psychology. On the flanks, my opponent does have some Dark Shards who are pushing into Snipe. He does have a trio of Hargoneth Executioners making up the core of his army. Over here, a single Reaper Bolt Thrower already picking me off and definitely applying pressure to me. It's definitely making me, or forcing me to push in to fight my opponent. And on the flank, he does have 3 units of Dark Riders with shields who are immediately rushing in, trying to get in on my Thunders. However, I do have this Thane here. I'm not entirely sure if my opponent noticed him in time. Regardless, the Thane does manage to land a very, very nice Tormentor Sword almost immediately. And these 2 poor units of Dark Riders are getting absolutely annihilated. The Slayers turn around and they dive right in. Over here, the Dragonback Slayers have jumped right on top of the Death Hag. They are slowing her down by 36%, and with the help of the Thunderers, they're absolutely annihilating her. Now, the Dark Shards are doing quite a bit of damage, but they are at the same time being counter battery fired by the Flame Cannon, which of course is going to be demoralizing them and shooting them down. My poor miners, of course, are having a very, very bad time with this. They're getting chopped up by the Hargoneth Executioners very, very easily, and they're going to be forced to rout pretty shortly. Marathi is also in the fray, just disrupting and messing those guys up really bad. But the Death Hag is in for a really bad time. She's going to go down like a 9-pin, and already you can see one of the Dark Shards is actually routing to that Flame Cannon fire. So things are looking fairly good for me. These Dark Riders are routing. These guys have shattered. Unfortunately, my opponent does get some Dark Riders on this Flame Cannon, which is definitely a bit bad. He actually picks off several models on the charge, which is definitely rather problematic. But I do have my Slayers on point, and the Slayers, if the Dark Riders try to stick around, they're going to get diced up by the Slayers very, very quickly. This is basically an optimal situation for the Slayers. Unfortunately, the Flame Cannon is losing crew at an astronomical rate, which is a huge problem for me. My miners have managed to get disentangled, and they're nuking down these Hargoneth Executioners with their grenades. You can see one of the Doom Bolts, or I do believe it's Doom Bolt. But regardless, it does go down. It hits my Thunders. But thanks to all that magic resistance, despite the fact that my opponent has been landing some pretty powerful Pit of Shades, for example, on these Gremlin Ironbreakers and that sort of stuff, it hasn't really been doing much for him. I have dropped, of course, all of my... At this point, I have dropped all of my various damaging debuffs. I've dropped my... both of my... the Runes of Wrath and Ruin, really beating up on these Hargoneth Executioners. The one unit of Hargoneth Executioners has already been routed off to 36 HP over there. These miners have been shot up, and they've run out of satchel charges, so I'm pushing them in against these Dark Shards. The Dark Shards don't have shields, so they're actually susceptible to Thunders, and you can see my opponent either does not notice or ignores these Flame Cannons, so my crew is able to escape and kind of waddle off, and they'll be able to recover. Now, there's a lot of Slayers here, in spite of the fact that theoretically these Slayers, I do believe, are somewhere over here. Most of the models are still over here, and so they're actually able to dice up these Dark Riders rather effectively. This is definitely, as I mentioned, a bad engagement for him. Over here you can see the Pit of Shades is definitely doing some damage, but I'm actually just letting my troops sit in there because I simply don't care. 40% magic resistance means that it's doing very, very little damage. Now, unfortunately, my Dragonback Slayers are practically annihilated. Surely they will be wiped out to man. And this unit of Slayers over here is also having a rather bad time, but it doesn't matter at this point because most of my opponent's large units are wiped out. These Dark Riders will go down shortly, and with that, my opponent's large contingent will be off the map. My Flame Cannon is, in the meantime, Flame Cannon crew is marching back to kind of get on top of the Flame Cannons. The Thunders do get routed off by Black Dragon Egg, which is definitely a bit problematic, and you can see my Rune Lord is taking absolutely terrible, dreadful fire from all those Dark Shards. He does, of course, have some missile resistance, of 35% plus I do believe 12% or it's 25% physical resistance. So he's actually taking 60% reduced damage, but it's still not that great. You can see over here the Rune of Wrath and Ruin is really massacring the Targeted Executioners. Over here you can see the Master of Wrath and Ruin just melting their HP down really, really easily. And the Dark Shards are definitely still hurting me quite a bit, but this Targeted unit has been broken. The Flame Cannon is now back online and opening fire on the Dark Shards. My Thunders are coming back online, so they'll be able to open fire. Focus on Morathi. You can see the Flame Cannon is doing some absolute work, monstrous work, just bringing down these Dark Shards down to size. Now, it isn't hitting consistently, but it hits enough, and with its huge splash, it's actually doing a rather good job. Plus, the Miners are coming in, the Thunders are now able to focus them. Things are looking pretty good. Now, there is, of course, of course, it is down to 2 guns, and it is being focused on by the Reaper Bolt Thrower, which is a bit of a problem. The Bolt Throwers are actually one of the better artillery pieces that counter battery fire, in my opinion, and I'm trying to get some Longbeards on that Bolt Thrower. The Norgrimling's Ironbreakers are now rushing in at the K-Knight Assassin, trying to surround him and beat him up in close quarters. And the Miners are now getting in among the Dark Shards and really kind of able to pressure them. Longbeards are not having a good time. They're not very good against Dark Shards. You can see another Pit of Shades does go down on the Thunders, and it does once again rather little damage. Simply put, my army is rather pretty resistant to those sorts of spells. My Runesmith is in really bad shape. Only the Master Rune of Negation is keeping him from dying. The Rune Lord is still here. You can see this guy's actually, despite being shaken and in bad shape, the Runesmith is still sticking around to the bitter end. These 2 Slayers are also chasing Morathi. Definitely not being very nice. You can see the Norgrimling's Ironbreakers are beating down this K-Knight Assassin. Their melee stats are not particularly good, but they're good enough. And once my Thane, he did catch these 2 units of Hargoneth Executioners with the Tormentor Sword, and that allows me to shoot them down and hopefully, and as you can see, shatter them. Now my Miners are over here trying to pursue the Dark Shards. I just want to keep them away from my main army, while of course the Longbeards are just chewing through this Reaper Bolt Thrower crew very, very easily. Over here, Morathi is actually doing rather well against the Rune Lord and the Runesmith, and that is because Morathi, as we saw in the beginning, has a lot of debuffs, AoE debuffs. You can see I'm trying to get my Thunders shooting in there, but as you can see, she's definitely focusing on the Rune Lord. I didn't notice that Assassin's Trophy had gone down on him. I hadn't realized that it was back off cooldown, and so that causes some pretty significant damage. And this is when I'm using my Master Runes of Wrath and Ruin to damage the Assassin, which isn't, of course, not the best of investments of that. But I have nothing else to use it on, really. My Thane jumps in there, he's going ham, but the Assassin actually has 42 melee defense, which, compared to the Thane's pretty pitiful 32 melee attack when he's being debuffed, it's actually pretty survivable. Morathi over here is slugging out with the Rune Lord and the Slayers, but the Rune Lord is definitely not having the best time of it. He's not the best melee combatant, and with all her debuffs, she's making him a practically useless melee combatant. Morathi's debuffs were definitely catching me by surprise in this game. You can see she does take down the 2 Slayers, but now my Thunder firing line is lining up, and they are going to start gunning her down. Over here, the Dark Shards actually did rout out the Miners in close quarters, but at this point, my opponent's army does rout, and that is game. So, definitely a bit of a tough matchup. The Morathi debuffs caught me by surprise. I hadn't actually paid too much attention to them, and I am not used to playing as Morathi. By far the most common pick for Lord for the Dark Elves is Malekith on a Black Dragon, and I would say the second most popular is probably the just the Dreadlord with Sword and Shield, I would say. So Morathi's a very rare pick. You don't see her very often, and I completely forgot about her debuffs, despite the fact that I did use her. I have used her a few times myself. Those debuffs definitely caught me by surprise, and they were helping our troops melt through my front line with incredible speed. The Longbeards, as you can see, did very, very little, as did the Norgrimling's Ironbreakers. My only melee unit that actually performed well was the Slayers themselves, because the Slayers racked up 134 kills. Most of those probably the Dark Riders, who they diced up very, very easily. The Flame Cannon did some absolutely monstrous work. The Thunderers did some okay work as well. They focused on that Death Hag incredibly quickly. And, yeah, so some of these units did really well. The Flame Cannon definitely impressed me. I think the Flame Cannon is now a worthwhile pick if you know what you're doing and you're capable of protecting it, at least reasonably well. The Rune Lord, I think, I don't believe that I think that the Rune Lord and the Thane were not given credit for the damage their Runes of Wrath and Ruin did. Or at least the kills they racked up, because I do believe that these Hargoneth Executioners did not simply go down to this handful of damage from the Longbeards. Though granted, there was not very many of them in this battle to begin with. My opponent's army was fairly thin. The Reaper Bolt Thrower, of course, got massacred by the Longbeards, but as you can see, Hargoneth Executioners did very well. The Dark Shards actually performed pretty well too, because I was simply not able to focus them. I had bigger fish to fry with my shooting. Only the Flame Cannon was really able to focus them, and it did pretty well. I made a mistake of letting the miners get caught by the Hargoneth Executioners before throwing their charges. That was a huge error on my part. The Thane definitely proved useful, and I think this is in general a fairly viable build against Dark Elves. Give or take, perhaps the hero, or maybe the Norgrimling's Ironbreakers are a little bit overkill. You could get 2 units of Longbeards for that, maybe 2 units of Longbeards with Great Weapons, or Dwarf Warrior, or maybe Dwarf Warriors or Miners with Satchel Charges, and a unit of the Grumbling Guard. There's a lot of different units you could run instead of the Norgrimling's Ironbreakers, but I didn't want to bring them in here just to kind of help anchor that front line, because they are nigh unbreakable. And yeah, so all in all, definitely a pretty cool match. I was definitely surprised by Mesmeric Revelation's decision to bring Marathi, and I think it's actually not a bad pick. She definitely performed rather well. One of my big saving graces of this game, I do think, was the Rune Lord having that improvement to magic resistance. Because my whole army having 40 rather than 25% magic resistance meant that even those Pit of Shades, those Pits of Shades, and some of those bombardment spells were just not doing anywhere near as much damage as they would against normal dwarf troops. And I definitely think it's not a bad... If you're going in against a faction that does have a decent amount of magic and likes magic, people often overestimate the built-in magic resist on the dwarves. But you can definitely... Those buffs are definitely worthwhile, and they can definitely, I think, turn the tide if you're going against a faction that likes to bring a lot of magic. So yeah, definitely a good game to my opponent. I do hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, be sure to leave a like and subscribe down below. If you have any comments, criticism, any questions about... Total War Warhammer 2, Mortal Empires, anything like that, be sure to post it down in the comments, and I will respond as soon as I can. As usual, guys, I do appreciate you all for watching, and I will see you all in the next one.